Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Alias Secure AF podcast, the podcast about all things cybersecurity. I'm your host, Teddy Underkoffler. Today, I am joined with Robert Leasure, security engineer here at Alias. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks for having me back. Always fun to be here talking about things.
Yeah, you bet. Always happy to have you. Today, we're actually going to be talking about password security, password management, but more on the sysadmin side and less on the actual end user side. So we'll be talking practical ways that sysadmins can better increase their policies and password procedures, I guess, and protect the business. So if you want to go ahead and open it up, tell me a little bit about why this is important on the sysadmin side.
Absolutely. So, you hear a lot about, making strong passwords, keeping your users trained and things like that. But what you maybe don't hear as much about is, what you should apply on the system administrator side, where the accounts you're dealing with are much more privileged in many cases and can do a whole lot more. And so really those passwords are a whole lot more important than just your average end user, or at least hopefully so.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, your end users might have similar rights on their own machines, but that's a whole other thing to talk about. But it's certainly worth putting extra effort into those system administrator passwords and the kind of the policies surrounding them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So go ahead and tell me, what are some of the different ways that they can actually put some of that effort in to better secure and better create those policies?
So number one, for system administrators, I would say isn't even necessarily regarding their passwords, but their daily use. Have a daily driver account that has the exact same privileges as any other person in your organization, and then have a separate privileged account when you need to make changes on the domain, or make privilege changes or add and install software, especially on sensitive machines. And that way, not only can you have a daily driver account that might follow the same password policy as everybody else, but then you can also apply separate rules to your privileged accounts and have those accounts have more stringent requirements. So, say you require 12 characters minimum for everybody in your organization, maybe step that up to 14 or 16 for your privileged accounts. So, not only are you using more strong passwords just by that nature of having a longer password and more stringent requirements, but also it's not the same as all your other accounts. So if there's some kind of breach or, your hashes get stolen, it's not in the same kind of space being cracked as all those average accounts.
Different verticals, really.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And that's not really something I hear talked about a whole lot. But I mean, it makes sense. You have an account where you use it for privileged things, but you only use it for that, and just have a different one for everything else.
Absolutely. And, not only your privileged accounts for each administrator maybe, but, if you're still using local admin accounts, which I wouldn't recommend to begin with, but, we still see it a lot, having local administrator accounts on machines. And in many cases, those local administrator accounts for each individual machine have the same password for every machine because they, if an administrator sits down and they don't know the password for that individual machine, it can kind of, take some time to look that up and figure out what it is. But in those cases where you have local administrator accounts, certainly rotate those passwords pretty often. If you have to use that setup, which I still wouldn't recommend. But also having those passwords have more stringent requirements and change more regularly than your regular user accounts.
So then it makes perfect sense to have different accounts for the sysadmins, right? Have one for the daily driver and then one for all of the activities that have to be used on the more privileged side. But how would it work with different department machines, right? Would they have an account for those machines, or would it have one account for all of them, or specific accounts for specific machines?
I would say in a scenario where you have local administrator accounts on every machine for that kind of ease of administration, even then setting kind of barriers between maybe different sections or departments, like you said, of machines where, most run-of-the-mill desktops may have the same password for that local administrator account. But then if you're talking about HR or accounting or payroll or in the case of medical data, for example, having different local administrator passwords for machines that handle that kind of stuff. So you have another layer of separation. Because, the worst case scenario is if somebody gets a local administrator password and that local administrator password that they got from some random desktop also happens to work on something like a domain controller or a sensitive accounting machine or payroll, and somebody gets access to that sensitive information, that's not something you want.
Right. Absolutely not. That would be terrible. And it makes perfect sense for, different departments to have different level access too, right? Like I am a person for the marketing department, right? I shouldn't necessarily have the same access that HR or accounting does, or, maybe admins or sales or whomever else should all have varying different access levels, I would think.
Absolutely. There's a whole other discussion there to be had about permissions on things like file shares where, if somebody doesn't need access to payroll, they shouldn't have access to payroll documents or information in things like a file share or any online tools that may be used for that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. What is a different way that sysadmins can so we talked a bit about having the different accounts, right, for passwords, devices, things of that sort, but what's a different way that they'd be able to approach this topic?
So there's the kind of the nitty-gritty information of going about these changes in policy, in group policy, setting different password requirements for different user accounts, including those kind of segmented accounts where they have maybe a daily driver account and the privileged accounts. Having different password policies, it can get a little messy if not implemented properly or in a way that kind of makes sense or is documented well. But it can certainly help improve security posture by having different policies for those different groups.
And when you say policies, you mean like character length and how often you have to reset it and that sort of stuff?
Absolutely. And not just in the technical policy way of group policy and Active Directory, but also documented policy in your organization that people can refer back to and go, oh, hey, these are the requirements for a privileged account's password, and these are the requirements for an end user's password.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of that comes down to password storage too. Like, where do you actually store your passwords? Do you write them down? Do you not write them down? Do you have LastPass? That sort of stuff.
Absolutely. Employing something like LastPass or another password manager is certainly another good step that can be taken to kind of help strengthen that password environment because, then you're not worrying about, oh no, am I going to remember this password? It's just, I have these very secure passwords that are randomly generated and I have access to my LastPass account.
Yeah. I mean, unless you lose access to your LastPass, then all you'd really have to worry about is MFA, right? If you log in, then you just have to have your separate device to do the two-factor, and then you should be good to go.
Absolutely. And touching on MFA, that's another thing I would strongly recommend in any environment is at least for your privileged accounts, have some type of multi-factor authentication so that password isn't a single point of failure. Because, then not only does somebody need to crack your password, but then they have to find a way to circumvent your multi-factor or, get that code for themselves.
And that is historically very difficult, right?
Not as difficult as you might think in some scenarios, but it throws another hurdle in the way. Another point where an attacker might just get bored or, quit because they're having a rough time and move on to the next target.
Yeah, that makes sense. The harder a target you can present yourself, then the less chances they're going to actually want to try and get through all of the different hurdles.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to touch on?
I would say one thing I would recommend that we haven't really touched on is, not just doing the training for your users and even your privileged accounts and the system administrators, but also doing auditing of your own organization's passwords. So, on a pen test, when we're doing a pen test, a big goal we have is to get domain administrator. And in the course of that, we may dump the SAM database from several machines, which kind of holds those passwords. And then we try cracking those passwords. But then at the end of the day, if we do get domain admin, we kind of approach clients and we're like, hey, we got this level of access, but, as an additional service, would you also like us to kind of audit your organization's passwords? Because with that level of access, we can then dump all of the passwords in Active Directory and start cracking those and say, okay, we have all of your users' passwords. How many can we crack in, say, an hour?
Oh my gosh.
And, that can be really terrifying for people sometimes
Yeah.
when we come back and say, hey, we cracked 30% of your users' passwords in an hour.
And you would think it wouldn't be as easy, but it is.
Absolutely. Cracking, people underestimate how quickly it can be done, especially when you get passwords in that way where it's a really weak hashing algorithm compared to some other ways of getting those hashes. But it lets you get a good idea of, okay, here's some passwords that are a really big problem, like our organization name 123, or,
Boomer
password.
Sooner.
Yeah, Boomer Sooner. Very common thing.
Uh-huh.
But also seeing, like, did we crack any domain administrator passwords in the course of that? Because, that's an entirely whole new level of that problem if that happens.
Now, I am kind of curious, if you do crack a domain user password, do you still present it as, hey, we got this password, but we've seen that you guys already have a required 2FA policy in place, so congratulations, while we have the password, which still needs to be addressed, we weren't able to get access?
We certainly take that into account, especially when we're making the report for that pen test where we're going, okay, we cracked a password, but we weren't able to use it.
Yeah.
So we weren't able to get access using that account. We may try other things like accessing Outlook or any, third-party services, not necessarily an Active Directory, and say, okay, so we weren't able to get access where multi-factor was required, but we were able to get access where it wasn't.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let's see. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or do you think that about covers it? Because we talked about auditing passwords just now. We've talked about sysadmins having separate accounts from their daily accounts, having stronger passwords on their privileged accounts, hopefully even MFA on the privileged accounts, segmenting inside, doing a little bit of policy enhancements, things like that sort. Was there anything else that we didn't touch on today?
I think maybe a little bit more on the actual group policy that can be put in place, because there's a whole lot of moving parts to Active Directory policy, and it can be really easy to miss something or not realize it's an option. One thing you absolutely want to make sure is disabled is reversible encryption.
Okay.
Because it's an option provided. It should never be enabled ever under any circumstances. Because it makes passwords incredibly easy to crack if you get access to any machine where that is the case.
Interesting. Why is that an option?
It's another one of those things that's just Windows legacy, and it's been there for 20 plus years, and they don't want to kill it now.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, so do not enable that is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And make sure you check the wording, because group policies can be confusing and say, this is what happens when it's enabled and this is what happens when it's disabled. And if it's disabled, I think for that specific option, disabled is what you want, because you don't want it to store using reversible encryption.
And what actually is reversible encryption?
It's basically saying we're going to store these passwords in a format that is easily reversible and can very easily be broken and, give you the original password.
Gotcha. So good to use if you need access to your internal passwords for a machine,
But no.
Bad.
Very bad. Yep.
But actually very terrible for security purposes.
100%.
Great.
And there's a lot of other policy options there that are super handy. Requiring complexity requires a certain amount of complexity. Minimum password length, like you said, but also minimum and maximum password age. So saying you can't use this password for more than 180 days. And that's certainly something I'd recommend is you make sure it is in place, because if you only if you allow passwords to sit around for a year or 2 years, that's within the window of, okay, even if it's a 12-character password, it might be able to be cracked in that amount of time.
Yeah. The longer you have the password just increases the potential for visibility, right?
Absolutely. And minimum password age is something that I think gets kind of slept on a lot, because people think, oh, if users want to change their passwords every other day, why not let them? Which sounds great in theory, but then the problem arises if somebody's changing their password that often, the odds are they're not changing it to a strong password that often.
Right.
They're probably incrementing on Boomer Sooner 123, Boomer Sooner 1234, Boomer Sooner 12345. So having that at something like 9 days is also good to set as well.
Well, and so if you have a password policy that says every 180 days you have to reset your password, can you have it set to where you can't reuse passwords? So you can't just filter through 2 different passwords every single time?
Absolutely, and that's another policy option as well. Password history, I believe, is what that is, and you can set that as high or low as you want. I'd say probably 18 plus for that, just so essentially your minimum password age times your password history is longer than your maximum password age. So somebody can't cycle their password around. In the case of, Boomer Sooner 123, 1234, if they're changing their password 15 times in a day, then they'll outrun that history requirement and be able to set their original password.
Gotcha. That's kind of devious. I didn't even consider that as an option.
There's some pretty sneaky ways to get around those group policy options.
A little bit of loophole there, which is one of those things where you wish you could just not have, but sometimes they exist.
There's always that 0.1% user that just figures it out and wants to use the same password forever.
Yep, exactly. Well, Robert, if you don't have anything else to add, I think that's all I've got for you.
I think that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the episode.
Thank you for having me.